Thank you very much, Charlie. And once again, thank you all for your support for the association. We had a wonderful opening of the foreign great ceremony for the association. Now, in the coming 20 minutes or so, I'd like to give you an overview of the green finance landscape. I'll cover three areas. One is global, including the G20 work that China initiated, and secondly, what China is doing, and thirdly, what I think Hong Kong should be doing going forward. Now, before getting to the specifics, let me just show you a few slides on why we should be doing green finance. This is a chart I used back 4 years ago when I wrote the book on PM 2.5 and economic policy. It shows the average PM 2.5 level in some of the global cities. On the left-hand side, the highest for 2013 was Delhi. It was 155. And a few lines after that, it's Beijing. That was 90. And I was joking to my colleagues in Beijing at that time that if you move from Beijing to Hainan, you can live 6 years longer. And you can also see Shanghai was about 60, and Hainan, a couple of cities in Hainan was 25, and 25 was a WHO standard for healthy air quality. Below 25, there are many cities. Most of these are OECD cities, and I thought just before a week ago, the lowest one was Sydney, that was 8. But recently I visited Oslo, and they showed me it was 3. In terms of the impact of pollution, this is a WHO study which shows that more than 12 million people die prematurely because of pollution on an annual basis. I think Christine knows these numbers better than anybody else. And about half of these are because of air pollution. In China, we have done a study, including with Beijing University and Tsinghua University professors, which shows that those who live in northern China, because of a burning of coal, and burning of coal generates PM 2.5, the life expectancy is shortened by 5.5 years relative to southern China. In addition to air pollution, China has serious water and land contamination. According to official figures, 75% of Chinese water are contaminated, and 20% of arable land is contaminated. What is the aggregate impact on the economy? According to World Bank study, it says the cost of pollution, including air pollution, water pollution, land contamination, is about 9% of GDP on an annual basis. We all know that the GDP is growing at 6-point-something%, which means that the green GDP is declining. Beyond the pollution issue, which everybody is talking about and complaining about, there's a bigger problem for the human being. That's global warming. This is a chart from a scientist in UK. She showed over the past hundreds of thousands of years this chart of CO2 emission. And you can see from that, in the last 100 years, CO2 emission went up dramatically. And over the past century, temperature rose in most of the globe. Northern part went up more than the rest. And you can see that the red parts are showing 4-degree increase in the past 100 years. And this trend is continuing, and it's accelerating. And this is because we burn a lot of fossil fuel. Over the past century, the human being increased energy consumption by 20-fold. What's the impact of global warming? This is one of them. Scientists show that a large part of the globe will experience serious drought conditions by 2060, which means that agriculture production will go down dramatically and 1/3 of species may disappear. The other impact, which is sea level increase. This is a picture I took a few days ago when I was invited by the Norwegian government to attend a seminar in the North Pole. I went to this little island, it's very close to the North Pole, and took this picture. Iceberg is melting and sea level is rising. When sea level rise at 1 or 2 meters, many of the coastal cities will be underwater, probably including Hong Kong. And I was joking to many of the financial sector friends that all financial centers seem to be on the coastal areas, including Hong Kong, London, New York, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. If we're not doing anything on global warming, all of these centers will be under the water. We should be trading on the mountains. And this is the third consequence, which is much higher frequency of extreme weather events, including a typhoon that Hong Kong experienced just last week. So what is the cause of the problem for both pollution and carbon emission? I think from economic perspective is because we have a seriously polluting economic structure. It has 3 components. One is a polluting industrial structure. Using Chinese data as example, China heavy manufacturing as a percentage of GDP is among the highest in the world. And we know that heavy manufacturing generates 10 times more emission in terms of PM 2.5 and carbon than services. Secondly, the energy composition is very polluting. We have more than 60% of the energy in coal, and coal burning generates 10 times more emission than clean energy. And finally, a polluting transportation structure. Most of us are driving, and we know that road transportation generates 10 times more emission than subway. So what do? We need to change all these 3 structures, make our industrial structure cleaner, make our energy structure cleaner, and make our transportation structure cleaner. And who should drive that? The investors. Because in the economy, investments drive the output. So by allocating more resources, financial resources, to the clean industry, clean energy, and clean transportation is the key. And who is responsible for making green investments? The traditional economics say that the government should be responsible because these green investment projects have externalities or are some kind of public goods. But the problem is that government doesn't have the money. Globally, the OECD estimated that we need 5 to 7 trillion US dollar green investment in areas such as pollution control, clean energy, clean transportation, green building, energy saving, and so on. In China, we estimate we need 600 billion US dollar in green investment every year. But we think the government can only provide 10% of that. 90% of green investments have to come from the private sector, which is you guys, the banks, insurance company, asset managers, and brokers raising money for green projects. This is why we need to develop a green financial system, not just in one country, but globally, to mobilize private sector green investment in order to fulfill our objective of green transformation of the global economy. Now let me say a few words on China initiative. Back in 2014, the PBOC initiated a green finance task force, which I led, and we made 14 recommendations to the central government on establishing a green financial system in China. It was immediately adopted by the central government, and it then became a mandate for the central bank to organize 7 ministries to draft the green finance guidelines. In 2016, the guidelines came out with 35 action points, providing incentives for the green sector, setting the taxonomy for green finance, and developing green financial products, including green bonds, green securities, green insurance, green funds, and so on and so forth. Now let me give you just a couple of examples on what China was doing in the past few years. Number one, in 2016, China became the largest green bond market globally. In that year, which is the first year China launched the market, we issued about $35 billion in green bonds, accounting for 40% of global green bond issuance. So some of European colleagues were joking with me, saying that China grew from 0 to hero within 1 year, because in 2015 our issuance domestically was 0. In 2016 we became the biggest in the world. Secondly, China launched 250 green funds in the past 3 years, including 50 green funds launched by local governments and 200 by the private sector. Thirdly, the PBOC introduced incentives for green projects. We realized that some of the green projects, because the externality is not fully internalized by pricing, the return is less than what the investors are looking for. So we have to enhance the return so that we can crowd in private sector investment. How do we do that? From PBOC perspective, it did two things. One is providing a re-lending facility for green projects, which means that the central bank lends cheap money to the commercial banks and asks commercial banks to lend at a lower cost than the market to the projects. The second thing we did is to introduce a green MPA scheme. MPA refers to macro-prudential assessment system, which is traditionally used for assessing prudential performance of a bank, including equity adequacy ratio and liquidity ratio and so on. But now we are putting green elements into this MPA assessment. For example, if a bank has a very high ratio of green loans, it gets higher score in the MPA. And this high score in MPA may translate into monetary incentive for the banks by the central bank. At the local level, as Laura was saying, China introduced 5 provincial pilot program for green finance. In fact, it included 8 cities in the 5 provinces. And some of the cities have introduced additional incentives for green projects. For example, in Huzhou, which is one of the pilot regions, they introduced interest subsidies for green projects. They classify green projects into 3 types: dark green, green, and light green. For dark green, they offer 12% subsidy, which means that if the base rate is 5, multiplied by 12%, that translates into 60 basis points subsidy from the government to the green project. And the company will only need to pay about 4.4% for the project funding. And many other regions have introduced different type of incentives in order to crowd in private sector money. Another important effort China made was to introduce compulsory disclosure requirement of environmental information on listed companies. In 2016, when we published this Green Finance Guideline, we indicated that we will introduce this on a compulsory basis. And right after that, CSRC came up with a document saying that we are taking a 3-step approach to move towards a compulsory scheme within few years. And the 3 steps are: number 1, in 2017, which is last year, China introduced a compulsory requirement for environmental information disclosure for major polluters, which are defined by the Ministry of Environment. These major polluters account for roughly 20% of the market in terms of listed company number. And this year, we're going to introduce a semi-compulsory scheme, which is similar to what Hong Kong is doing. Namely, if you don't disclose, you have to explain to the market why. And by 2020, China will introduce compulsory requirement for environmental information disclosure for all listed companies. And by then, I think China will be the only large economy that has introduced a compulsory scheme on environmental information disclosure, which is critical, in my view, in driving the capital market resource to green. Because only if the capital market can identify who is green, who is not green, will the market be able to effectively allocate resource to the green sector and reduce exposure to the brown sector. The next example is we introduced environmental risk analysis tools to the banking system. Back as early as 2015, I, as the chairman of China Green Finance Committee, asked the ICBC to begin testing this environmental risk analysis model. And they did it for all major polluting sectors. For example, for cement, for steel, for coal-fired power, chemical, and so on. Try to see whether lending to these areas will involve higher non-performing loan ratio in the coming few years. And the analysis shows yes. By doing this analysis, it will incentivize the banks to reduce exposure to the brown sector and increase exposure to the green sector, which is essentially doing what the fiscal guys should be doing. It's almost equivalent in terms of impact on fiscal subsidy for green and penalty in terms of taxation for brown. But it doesn't cost the government a penny just by introducing a model. Of course, the green finance agenda has just started in China. We've done a lot in the past few years, but many, many more things are to be done, including capacity building, more product innovation, and application of fintech, and also sharing and consolidation of environmental information. Now let me move on to the G20 initiative. As you know that China was hosting G20 in 2016, and that was what I call a once every 20-year opportunity for China to set agenda for G20 discussion. And in that year, we decided to introduce green finance as a key agenda item in G20. And indeed, the China-initiated G20 Green Finance Study Group, for which I'm a co-chair, has successfully mainstreamed the idea of green finance among global leaders. Back 4 years ago, if you pick randomly a central bank governor or finance minister and you ask him what is green finance, I think his answer is probably, I beg your pardon. But in 2016, we asked the 20 largest economists, finance ministers, and central bank governors to read our document 4 times in a year. And this is what we call mainstreaming. And all of them are now experts of green finance. And all the presidents, they signed off the G20 communique, which include a major statement on scaling up green finance globally in the Hangzhou summit. This is what we did in the first year, which is 2016, actions to do for green finance, including points such as sending government policy signals and adopting green finance principles. Second year, which is 2017, the G20 Green Finance Study Group continued under German presidency, and we looked at the 2 more issues. One is called environmental risk analysis by financial firms, exactly what we're doing with ICBC, and also improving availability of environmental information. This has to do with disclosure. And the year 3, that's 2018, under Argentina presidency of G20, this group continued, but it's changing the name a little bit to Sustainable Finance Study Group. And this year, we've been looking at 3 new topics, including securitization of sustainable assets, development of sustainable Ps and VCs, and finally, application of digital technology to green finance. All these, I think, will represent major new trends in green finance in the coming 5 to 10 years. Just a few words on EU initiative. EU put together a HLAG, which is a high-level expert group, to study green and sustainable finance in 2016. After nearly 2 years of work, they proposed an action plan to the European Commission, which was adopted, and in March 2018, the European Commission came up with an action plan on sustainable finance. And these are the key items in the EU action plan, which includes the need for develop green taxonomy, develop EU labels on green assets, developing fiduciary duty for institutional investors to take into account ESG factors, and considering green supporting factors such as the lower risk weights for green assets, and improving disclosure of environmental and climate information. Now, let me just say one word on the green supporting factor. This is a topic not only being discussed in EU, but also by the central banks and the supervisors network on greening the financial system. This is a network which I view as a spillover of the G20 work, because within G20, it's a consensus-based process. You even need to get any agreement. Everybody from the G20 countries have to agree, which is quite difficult. And we found that the smaller subset of the G20 are more willing to move aggressively. And that's essentially what the central bank network is. So it started off with 8 central banks, including the French, the Chinese, and German, UK. I'm representing PBOC on the network and chairing the supervision work stream of the network. And now the network has grown to 15 central banks and the supervisors. This network is discussing this issue of supporting factor. And this supporting factor essentially refers to the possibility of introducing lower risk weight for green assets on the bank's balance sheets. And we found that the immediate difficulty is that in most countries there's no green loan definitions. And that's why they cannot calculate the green loan default rates. And that's why they cannot prove green loan default less than non-green loans. So from a financial stability perspective, there's no basis for the financial regulator to introduce such a new measure. But with the exception of China. China has developed green loan definition as early as 5 years ago, and we have collected the green loan data, collected the green loan default rates, and we show that the green loan NPL ratio is only 0.4% versus overall NPL ratio in the banking system of 1.8%. So I think China is in a much better position to consider introduction of lower risk weights for green assets first. And once this is done, as my colleague from Industrial Bank was showing me, suppose we reduce risk weights from 100% to 50%, that reduces the funding cost for all green loans by 50 basis points. It's a very strong driver for green transformation in the banking sector. And I'm looking forward to more study to support this initiative. Now, let me just say a few words on what Hong Kong should do. These are my perspective, for consideration by the regulators as well as by the industry. Firstly, I think Hong Kong needs to develop a policy framework which, based on international experience, has at least 4 elements. One is you need to have a taxonomy, defining what's green, for example, green loans and green bonds and so on. Even if you don't want to do your local definition, but you have to specify which definition you use. And secondly, providing some incentives to reduce the funding cost for green projects with sufficient environmental benefits, but insufficient returns. And thirdly, improving disclosure. And finally, developing more products and tools and methodologies to enhance capacity of financial sector. Now, specifically, I think 4 actions are requiring some consideration. Number 1, developing a set of green banking guidelines for Hong Kong-based banks, which may include definition of green loan statistics, and environmental risk management principles for Hong Kong-based banks. Secondly, growing Hong Kong's green bond market by actively marketing its services. I know there are very good incentives of Hong Kong, green bond issuance in Hong Kong, but not everybody outside Hong Kong actually know these incentives, so promotion is key. And we as an association, I think, can play a major role in this area. Thirdly, incubating green asset managers. For example, can we consider HKMA and MPF, which have a lot of money, public money, to allocate a small chunk to incubating such asset managers. Number 4, providing incentive for green financial services, which I mentioned earlier, including by interest subsidies, guarantees, and grants. Number 5, enhancing environmental/climate disclosure requirement on listed companies. As I said, China will introduce compulsory disclosure requirement by 2020. If Hong Kong remains semi-compulsory by 2020, I think Hong Kong will be lagging behind China by then. So shall we do something? Number 6, building capacities among Hong Kong financial institutions on products, tools, and models for environmental risk analysis. This is another area I think our association can contribute to. Once again, thank you very much for listening and for participating in this event. I'm looking forward to working with you in making Hong Kong's financial system greener. Thank you.